War. Responsible for millions of deaths over the millennium. The more advanced warfare became, the higher the death toll from these military conflicts grew, leading to the largest and bloodiest the world had ever seen, World War I.
It is claimed that both sides expected the battle to last a short amount of time, a day or two maybe, but nobody expected the 6 days of hell it actually turned into. As the battle progressed, the large field where the combat took place was decimated, with scorched earth and debris littering the body-covered ground.
This led to hundreds upon thousands of soldiers dying for only a few yards of advantage.
Both sides made little new ground during the conflict. But the one thing both sides gained halfway through was a new step towards the upper hand.
When looking into defining aspects of the war, nothing is as prevalent to the war as trench warfare was. Trench warfare is commonly seen in media as a norm of fighting that's gruesome and terrible to instill a fear in the viewers' hearts. This here is a full-scale model of a trench from World War I. When looking into the French and German trenches, you can see very big differences into why they were made and how they were made. The Germans thought that the war would be a large global conflict and that it would span many years. With this in mind, they dug the trenches deep and had reinforcements of wood, metal, and sandbags to protect themselves. France, on the other hand, thought the war would last a couple months, not the 4 years that it really was. With this in mind, they dug them shallow without any reinforcements. It was just dirt walls, which didn't provide any protection for their soldiers. Later into the war, France caught on to what was really going on, and they decided to add more reinforcements, like so. When looking into trench warfare, there's 4 main defining aspects that make a trench what it is. The first main aspect is the walking area. The walking area is about 3 to 6 feet wide and is for soldiers to walk from place to place, which could span for miles. In rainy seasons, however, there could be mud and water drowning the trench, and soldiers would have to trudge through that to get to places. The second main defining aspect of the trenches were the firing step. The soldier would put their knee onto the firing step, like so, and fire at the opposing line, and be able to shoot while having protection for their heads. The third main defining aspect was the ammunition shelf. Soldiers would carve out shelves above the firing step at about chest height and put ammo inside of it, so that when they were firing at the front line, they could constantly rechange their ammo and they wouldn't have to lower their defenses to change ammo. The fourth and final main aspect of the trenches were the dugouts. The dugouts were dug into the walls of the trenches and were an area for the soldiers to rest and relax from the horrors of the war. These provided protection from shells and gunfire, but if the dugouts weren't dug deep enough, the shells could penetrate and kill all of the soldiers inside. While it provided protection from gunfire and shells, they still had to worry about mud, water, rats, and plague. This meant that the soldiers had to be on alert 24/7 and they didn't have any real time to rest. The trenches brought out a terrible aspect of the war, and were one of the horrible inventions that the war brought out.
War. Responsible for millions of deaths over the millennium. The more advanced warfare became, the higher the death toll from these military conflicts grew, leading to the largest and bloodiest the world had ever seen, World War I. Spanning 4.5 years, the first global war was one that revolutionized wartime techniques and technologies, from tanks to chemical warfare. The first war that engulfed the world was a bloody and brutal one. But this introduction of new firearms and techniques was one that required a slower, more grueling, and defensive kind of combat: trench warfare.
Trench warfare was commonly used during World War I as the conflict norm between two sides, with trenches significantly slowing down the frequency of conflicts but speeding up the rate of fatalities. This led to hundreds upon thousands of soldiers dying for only a few yards of advantage. Now you may be wondering, at what point in this war was this form of combat adopted?
The date was September 6, 1914, only a month and a half after the start of World War I, and the Allied forces in France had been engaged in a conflict with German forces. The Allied forces retreated to the Marne, though, with the German front quickly catching up with them. It is claimed that both sides expected the battle to last a short amount of time, a day or two maybe, but nobody expected the 6 days of hell it actually turned into. With over 500,000 casualties by the end of it all, both sides made little new ground during the conflict. But the one thing both sides gained halfway through was a new step towards the upper hand. Since desperate times called for desperate measures, this battle resulted in the creation of the first trenches.
Neither side would budge, refusing to lose so many troops just to retreat. So they made their own cover, with each side having soldiers at the rear of the battle dig rough trench cover. These trenches stretched for miles on both sides of the battlefield, with the soldiers at the front on both sides retreating to the new trenches, resulting in the first no man's land between both sides' trenches.
As the battle progressed, the large field where the combat took place was decimated, with scorched earth and debris littering the body-covered ground. This was clearly no place to fight, with cover for the soldiers being almost non-existent. No Man's Land. Considered the most dangerous place on Earth, No Man's Land was the place most soldiers called a death sentence. A place so dangerous, the majority of deaths from the war occurred in No Man's Land, with snipers and machine gunners posted all over the trenches. Even sticking out a pinky above the trench would result in only 9 fingers.
The trenches were always designed for a combination of cover, living quarters, base command, and military barracks. Artillery was stationed across almost the entire stretch of the trenches. In fact, almost every soldier was armed and ready to die in No Man's Land. However, some soldiers had to remain unarmed due to a lack of weapons in the war. This caused the unarmed soldiers to make a pact with the armed soldiers. This pact was once the armed soldier died in battle, the unarmed soldier would pick up their rifle and continue fighting on. This made them more aware of their impending doom in the battle. This illustrates how slim their chances of survival were seen in the war.
By the end of World War I in 1918, the trenches stretched for 35,000 unconnected miles across Europe, with dug-up earth acting as graves for the soldiers who fought over No Man's Land. The decimated area still remain to this day, like a scar on the face of the earth. A grim and gruesome reminder of what life and death can be like in the trenches.
Our propaganda is designed to encourage men who can to join the French army. It uses multiple techniques and some subjectively deceptive messages in order to make joining the French army seem desirable. The first technique used by this poster is patriotism. The French flag is used to fight off an eagle, which was a symbol often used to represent Germany during World War I. The eagle is depicted as large and imposing, which is meant to create a sense of fear and illustrate that Germany is a threat to France. The soldier is prominently wielding a French flag to fend off the eagle. This demonstrates that those who fight in the war have the opportunity to represent France and serve their country. The soldier in our propaganda is depicted in a heroic manner. However, trench warfare from the perspectives of those who fought in World War I may not have been as glorious or heroic as the poster suggests. To quote Ernest Hemingway in his World War I novel, Farewell to Arms, "There were many words that you could not stand to hear, and finally, only the names of places had dignity. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene." End quote. Finally, the chances of dying or being injured in the war were great, with the percentage of French casualties to mobilized soldiers being very high. Their chances of returning home unscathed in general were not likely, so suggesting the glorious return to praise and celebration as a reason to join the French army doesn't hold up with this perspective. In the end, this propaganda was designed to paint a picture of glory, heroism, and patriotism, but its stated and implied messages are somewhat deceptive.
This graph shows a number of things, most of those being the number of the soldiers mobilized by their own countries. The following countries sent out the most: Russia, Germany, and Great Britain. These three countries, the amount of soldiers they sent out had a total of over half of all the soldiers sent out in all of the war, and it was quite a costly amount. It is quite interesting, though, how the U.S. managed to mobilize so many troops, yet over the course of the war, lost very few to end up with small amounts of wounded or prisoners of war.
As seen in this graph of military spending over the span of World War I, the countries that spent the most money were usually the ones that were most involved, with Germany and Great Britain coming out somewhere around $35 billion. Meanwhile, Russia, the United States, and France all came in around $20 billion, and Belgium and Canada, seen right here, spent barely anything, which is odd, especially for Belgium, considering the fact that they were caught up in the middle of the warfare in most cases.
These two maps demonstrate the advances made in the Western Front through 1914 to 1918. The Western Front composed of France, Belgium, and Germany. France was on the Allied powers, Germany was on the Central powers, and Belgium decided to stay neutral, despite Germany ransacking and destroying its land on the way to fighting France. The first point of interest is the farthest German advancement made in 1914. Germany started to do a swift, strong attack towards Paris to get the entire country to crumble. Thankfully, France defended the country, but only 25 miles away from Paris. If the Germans had succeeded using this strategy, it would have been called a blitzkrieg, which is a fast, swift, sudden attack. These lines moving to the north were called the Race to the Sea. France and Germany were caught in this epic stalemate where they were trying to outflank each other and control the sea. If one of them had reached the sea, they would have controlled it and would have had the navy, which would have controlled the entire war. Our final point of interest is the River Somme, shown right here. The River Somme is where the bloodiest and worst battle of the war took place, the Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme was very bloody and was also the debut of the tank in the war. This is very interesting because it's one of the farthest advancements made, and in 1914. This means that the Germans had to take all the way from their territory through French territory that has been shelled and bombed, all the way to the River Somme, where they finally were able to use it and surprise France. This map provides great insight into what really happened on in the Western Front and shows how the tides were constantly shifting in World War I.
There aren't many songs written about World War I. There was one song I did find interesting, though, that of the few that were written. It was written somewhat recently. It's a song called Christmas in the Trenches. It's a song about a man from Liverpool and the Christmas truce that occurred during the middle of a worldwide war. We thought it applied considering it took place in trenches and how holy and special that night was to all the soldiers who participated many of years ago. We've chosen 2 poems that we feel best describe the feeling of trench life and how soldiers spent their days shooting and dodging bullets for years. One of them being Suicide in the Trenches, very grim, while the other just In the Trenches. While for years watching them die and suffer, the soldiers, and the loss of friends and loved ones, these poets and soldiers themselves have written poems that we feel better describe their era than we could have ever.
As seen here, along within our human connection piece, letters were a huge part of bringing home to the war front, with soldiers writing letters like these to remind themselves of why they were fighting. Every soldier was always armed with pen and paper when letting their minds leave the battlefield while writing letters to their friends and loved ones, while they let their guards down in the harsh environment they lived in when they received and read letters from their homes. The letters they received back painted a vivid picture of their home lives, letting those caught up in this brutal war escape in these words for a while. With 12 million letters being sent every week to and from the trenches, we can only imagine what these letters of love, loss, hope, and hardship truly said.
For this project, we made some infographics. We chose the topics of these infographics based on some important data and some interesting facts based around World War I trench warfare. First, I'm going to talk about our first graphic, which is disease in the trenches, and then I'm going to talk a bit about a second graphic. So first off, many of the diseases in the trenches were caused by poor conditions, such as extreme cold and other weather conditions. One such diseases is called trench fever. Now, trench fever affected 9% of soldiers. The reason it affected so many soldiers is because it is caused by lice, and many of the soldiers weren't able to maintain proper hygiene while in the trenches, so many of them suffered from this disease. Some of the symptoms of trench fever were recurring fever and muscle aches. Our second graphic shows the difference between the distance of trenches built by the Allies versus the distance of trenches built by the Central Powers. As you can see, the Central Powers had almost 2 times more in the distance of trenches built versus the Allies, at almost 23,000 miles of trenches constructed. Now, the Central Powers trenches were also much better built and equipped to last long periods of time.
Here are the 10 images from the French area of trench warfare, no pun intended, that we decided very well depicted trench life. The young boys and soldiers who spent their lives in constant fighting They did have some photos to keep for us to all see down these days. Some of the more important images and keynotes we decided on were the ones that showed soldiers having a good time. It is very hard to find those pictures. Most of the time, soldiers were in constant fighting and trying to just stay alive. It's hard to believe what they had to do back then. Well, most of the time, they just were sitting in ditches trying to stay alive. They were sent out there to live, but most of the time, they would just end up dying. And we're happy to see that some of them actually did enjoy their time out there and lived a good life.
When looking into artifacts and pieces of the war, our team was really intrigued by letters that soldiers wrote to their friends, family, and loved ones back at home when they were inside the trenches. These can really help us provide insight onto what was happening inside the war and can show the terrible conditions of the trenches and the war as a whole. One of these letters is very eye-opening and shows the horrible conditions of the war. Written by Jonathan Simons, a French soldier in the trenches, to his friends, families, and loved ones back at home. I'm going to read a few lines right here. The weather is simply awful, raining day after day and especially night after night. To tell you the truth, while writing this letter, I am wet through to the skin and not a dry thing for a change. It was pitch dark, no light allowed, and in a strange place. Well, honestly, I fell over at least 20 times, got smothered in mud from head to foot, and on top of that, wet, though it rained in torrents. This excerpt from the letter really shows the terrible conditions that the soldiers had to go through. They were covered in mud from head to foot. They had trudged through water up to their waists and knees, and they didn't even have anything to change in. This could cause tons of diseases for them to go through. On top of these horrible conditions, they also had to fight a war. They had to go over the top of the trenches, they had to shoot at soldiers, and they had to live in a constant fear of death, hearing the shells booming at them, the guns firing, and the rats running around. All of this was really terrible and showed what all the bad stuff that happened in the war. These letters are eye-opening, but also kind of terrifying to what happens in the war in World War I.
$8.5 million deaths. Out of this incomprehensibly large number of military casualties, most of them occurred while fighting in the trenches. The constant barrage of artillery fire, rampant disease, and poor conditions being the main culprits for most of the deaths in the trenches. These casualties had a lasting effect on Europe, as many countries lost a significant percentage of their population to the Great War. Some countries were hit much harder, with France's death count at the end of the war sitting at over 1.3 million, and Russia's exceeding 1.7 million deaths. In fact, the devastation of these losses, combined with the economic turmoil and humiliation of defeat, eventually drove Germany to cause an even greater war with even greater losses, World War II. The losses from the war will not soon be forgotten, even today. In 2014, Britain commemorated the British soldiers who died in the war with a memorial in the form of an art piece. To remember their fallen soldiers from World War I, they handmade hundreds of thousands of ceramic poppies and placed them in the grass. This formed a large ocean of red poppies, and the memorial allowed people to see both the individual flowers and the large scale of all the flowers put together. In the form of a sea of flowers, this truly helps us visualize how many families were devastated and how many young lives were ended in the trenches of World War I on an individual scale. It is hard to overlook the long-term effects of trench warfare on Europe, even now, over 100 years into the future.
Communication with those close to you is a huge part of everyone's lives, and this can easily be seen through the letters sent in World War I to and from the trenches. With millions being sent every day during the 4-year period of the Great War, you can only get rough estimations of the level of paper that must have been littering the trenches with memories and words during this period. But most sources believe that about 12 million letters were sent every week. That works out to 71,428 letters every hour, and 1,190 letters every minute. Now, in my hand is 1,190 letters, which, as said before, works out to about a minute in letters for the wartime. It would take about 60 bags of these to get to an hour of letters, and 1,428 more bags to get to just a day of letters. I hope this conveys to you the scale of not just the war, but the scale of people's ability to find the inner part of them that is fighting for others, and that these letters were what gave these soldiers the will to go on in the hellscape of the trenches. Thank you.